1896, the election of 1912, 1932, 1968, and 1980. Maybe. If you wanted to jot some notes, Stephanie, I would go to that. You could go to those sections where the presidents, right? So the first president in your book, if you wanted to jot notes for the first election that we go to, is Jefferson. And I guess what I would say is this. The reason I picked these elections is I probably saw a list somewhere of important elections, but I also kind of thought that these are significant presidential elections that have important implications for at least the immediate future of the country at the time. Now, the first election is 1800. And 1800 is ultimately the first election that is contested between major political parties. Now remember, when the Constitution, I can't really complain because it's after school. I wish I could, I would like to, but I can't complain because it's after school. That's all legit. And it's also Sean Whelan's people. Right, my enemy, Sean Whelan, one and only friend, and not a very good one, frankly. Sean Whelan's people. Now, if you remember, when the Constitution was ratified, right, there was a dispute over whether or not to ratify. And we were talking about this in our last review session. Here is 55 people, eventually 42 people, who last till the end of a convention that was called for the purpose of modifying the Articles of Confederation. Those 55 and eventually 42, because I say 55 because at one time or another 55 people attended the Constitutional Convention. 42 of them lasted until the end. Now, those 55/42 people defied their orders, created a new Constitution, and then suggested to the Congress under the Articles of Confederation that they should present this Constitution to the country and that each state should decide whether or not they wanted to ratify it in a special convention. Now, they also said that when 9 of the 13 states ratified by special convention, that this would be the law of the land, the structure of government for the future. Now, we know there was spirited opposition against the Constitution, and we talked about this. We said the spirited opposition against the Constitution came from a faction that were eventually referred to as the Anti-Federalists. And the Anti-Federalists feared a lot of things, but the one thing that they feared was that the Constitution would establish a powerful government that would threaten their liberties and the legacy of the Revolution. And their fears were to some extent assuaged by a promise of a Bill of Rights, which is something that transpires in the aftermath of the ratification. But the challenge is going to be to implement this new Constitution. And remember, we talked about that. We said under the Constitution there would be a powerful president. Right? And this powerful president of the United States would be elected by an electoral college, and those electors to the electoral college would be selected by state legislatures on whatever basis that they saw fit, and then that those electors would vote for president and vice president, and that person, once elected as president, would have far-reaching powers. You know, they would execute the laws of the land, they would be able to veto legislation, they would be in charge, the commander-in-chief of the military, they would be able to participate in foreign policy, to make treaties with the advice and the consent of the Senate, to appoint high-ranking officials. All of these things would be given to a new president, right? So the president was going to be fairly powerful. This was one of the things that the Anti-Federalists were afraid of. A powerful president would become a king. The first president was George Washington. He was unanimously elected and re-elected, elected in 92, re-elected in 96. He appoints a cabinet, and the cabinet includes Alexander Hamilton, clearly the most conservative delegate to the Constitutional Convention. Hamilton, wanted an even more powerful national government than was created by the Constitution. And Hamilton and Washington and the First Congress are going to implement or give life to this new system of government. As they're doing that, right, disputes are going to break out. And those disputes are going to be largely over the size and the power and the authority of the national government, right? And we're going to see that with the argument over a national bank. Now, remember, Hamilton is going to see a national bank as being crucial to kind of setting the stage for economic development of the United States. And what Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury wants to do is lay the foundations for what was achieved by the United States in the 20th century. Hamilton sought to see the United States be a powerful, industrial, agricultural, commercial, balanced economy. And in order to do that, he believed that you needed a sound financial structure, which he believed part of it was chartering a national bank. The question was, could the government do this? Right? Was the federal government, authorized by the Constitution to do that? Right? And Jefferson and Madison are going to say no, and Hamilton is going to say yes, and the dispute of the power of the federal government is going to not begin there, but really crystallize to some extent over Hamilton's financial proposals. Is the government going too far? Are they taking actions that are going to benefit the few at the expense of the many? Right? And opposition to Hamilton and his actions are going to emerge in the form of political parties, right? The faction to oppose Hamilton are going to call themselves Republicans because they want to institute true republicanism. The faction that defends Hamilton are going to call themselves Federalists. And so these two parties are going to emerge, and through the 1790s, these parties are going to be extraordinarily rancorous to one another. Both sides are going to consider the other side as intent on destroying the Republican experiment. The Republicans are going to consider the Federalists monarchists. The Federalists are going to consider the Republicans to be kind of mobocracy or mob rule or chaotic. Both sides are going to fear if the other side takes power that the Republican experiment is going to be destroyed either by chaos or tyranny. And the French Revolution makes it worse, right? Intensifies both sides. Now, in '96, John Adams is going to be elected to the presidency, and as a Federalist, sort of, and Thomas Jefferson is going to oppose him as a Republican, sort of. But in his administration, the rancor between Federalists and Republicans is going to get even worse. And now in 1800, this election that we wanted to focus on, you have, for the first time, sort of this kind of very clear, rancorous kind of division between the Republicans who believe they are defending the spirit of the Revolution and the Federalists who believe they are defending the country from dangerous kind of mobocracy. Now, Jefferson wins the election. In the election of 1800, it is Thomas Jefferson, the Republican, versus John Adams, the Federalist. Jefferson wins the election and proclaims that it is another revolution. He says this is another revolution. Now here's my question. Why did he say that? In what regard was the election of 1800 considered to be, by the Jeffersonians, another revolution? What were they saying? Right? What were they saying? Go ahead, Matt.
Has to do with the spirit of 76?
Yes, so go ahead. Ian, help your ex-friend out. It does have to do with the spirit of 76. But go ahead, Ian, what do you think?
So it's going to go back to...
Yes. I mean, now we're going to do it right. Now we have taken the power of government away from the monarchists, away from Hamilton, and now we are going to do it right. right? We are going to install the proper relationship for the federal government and the people and the states. No longer are the affluent and aristocratic going to be able to dominate the federal government for their own benefit. It's another revolution. We're returning the power of government to the people. And Jefferson aspired to weaken the power of the national government in lieu of state power, etc. And so, really the significance of the election of 1800 is that Jefferson's another revolution is a further step in sort of the democratization of America. Now when I say that, look, the Declaration of Independence is a democratic document. The Declaration of Independence says, look, everyone is equal, freedom is important, and self-government is the way things should go. Now this is by all accounts liberal. It trusts the people. The Constitution is a conservative document. Look, with kind of a trust of the people, things came to some extent unraveled. Now we've got to institute this new powerful national government to keep the passions and emotions of the people in check. Now, after that's implemented in a manner that the legacy of the revolution is feared to be jeopardized, the Jeffersonians say, now we're going to set it straight, right? Now we are going to do it right. Now, to some extent, it does represent the democratization. Because, I mean, if you think about it, after Jefferson's election, a Federalist is never going to be elected to office again, right? I mean, Adams is the last Federalist, and in 1820, there isn't even Federalist opposition to Monroe's re-election, right? So the Federalist Party that implemented the initial Constitution is going to fade away. And the people are going to have more say-so in government. I mean, Jefferson kind of unleashes, the democratization. Jacksonian democracy that we're familiar with, that is symbolized by Jackson's ascension to power, the power of the people voting for electors to the Electoral College, the common man in politics, rancorous elections, starts with the election of 1800. It ushers in that era. Okay. Second election. So if I were to ask you this now in retrospect, why is the election of 1800 important? Based on what we said and what you know. Now, I mean, after just kind of mindlessly listening to what I said, why would you say the election of 1800? Why would we pick it? Now after what we said and what you know, why did we pick it? Yes.
It was a step towards American democracy.
That's a good way of putting it. I like that. It's a big step towards more democratization, right? Why else, Charlie? Any other reasons it's important? Yeah, I mean, it's the first time there is this kind of, major distinction in parties that's going to be resolved. Another reason it's important is the first peaceful transfer of power between rival political factions. I mean, the Federalists had power and were voted out of office, and they surrendered that power to the Republican faction, which they were bitterly opposed to. Which is a remarkable accomplishment. Any peaceful transfer of power is a remarkable accomplishment, even today. But the peaceful transfer of power in 1800 between bitter rival factions is a remarkable accomplishment. Okay, second election. I thought about including the election of 32, who incidentally was elected in 32 or re-elected in 32. And why might that be on the short list, but I didn't include it. Does anybody remember besides, Jackson was re-elected. Does anybody remember who he defeated in 32? Oh, it's always a good guess, right? Henry Clay. But we didn't. Let's go to the election of 60. The election of 60 is obviously the election in which Abraham Lincoln is elected to the presidency. The run-up to that election had been very, very rancorous, and the issue was the extension of slavery into the territories. Abraham Lincoln and the party that nominated him, the newly minted Republican Party, were absolutely committed to stopping the extension of slavery in the territories. So Abraham Lincoln was nominated by the Republican Party. The Republican Party had come into existence in 1854. Does anybody remember what event in 54 prompted the kind of spontaneous creation of a political party? Anyone besides myself? Marissa, it's going to have to be you then that identifies the event. No? You say it again? Not yet. I mean, you can make that argument, but yes, go ahead. The question is that the Republican Party that nominates Lincoln in 60, right, starts in 54 in response to. Yeah, go ahead. And Kansas, Nebraska. The Kansas, Nebraska. Does anybody remember, Wormsy, do you recall what the Kansas, Nebraska Act did? Yes. It opened what territory to popular sovereignty? Yeah, I mean, part of the Louisiana Purchase, the Missouri Compromise had banned slavery north of the 3630 line in the area that had been acquired from Louisiana. As a result of Kansas, Nebraska, so then could we say this, that Kansas, Nebraska repealed the Missouri Compromise and opened that territory to slavery under the terms of popular sovereignty. That piece of legislation galvanized a part of Northern public opinion to create a party that was committed to preventing the spread of slavery into the territories. And that party was called the Republican Party. Now, ultimately, what party did the Republican Party replace? You know, the Democratic Party is going to be there, right? So the Republican Party replaced another party. Do you remember? Andrew, do you remember? The Whigs. The Whig Party died in 54, and you'll never guess who else died, not in 54, died in 52. You'll never guess who else died in 52. Henry Clay, right? Because he was the big Whig, right? And he died in 52, and with his death went this party, and so did Daniel Webster. And, you know, Northerners and others were looking for a political home, and they gravitated towards this newly formed Republican Party that was committed to stopping the extension of slavery into the territories. Now, the Democratic Party was divided between two factions. One faction supported the extension of slavery into the territories or anywhere else. That was the Southern faction. They were supporters of the Dred Scott decision. What did the Dred Scott decision, why would we say the Southern faction of the Democratic Party supported the Dred Scott decision in the 1860 election? Lincoln's party was committed to stopping the spread of slavery into the territories. They were the Republican Party. They nominated Abraham Lincoln. The Southern Democratic Party is going to nominate in this election John Breckinridge. And they were committed to the Dred Scott decision. If I would say that, what does that mean? Go ahead, Nola. What did the Dred Scott decision say? We talked about this yesterday.
We could spread slavery. It's Constitution can't regulate.
Yes, the Congress cannot prevent the spread of slavery into the territories. So that slavery should be permitted to go wherever in the territories, uninhibited and even protected You know, the southern wing of the Democratic Party wanted a national slave code to protect slavery in the territories until those territories were incorporated as states. Then once they became states, the states could decide for themselves what they wanted to do with slavery. A moderate wing of the Democratic Party believed in popular sovereignty. And that wing nominated Stephen Douglas. So the moderate wing of the Democratic Party, the northern and midwestern wing of the Democratic Party, believed in popular sovereignty, allowing the people that went there to decide the status of slavery for themselves, and they nominated Stephen Douglas. So you have three candidates in the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, who is committed to stopping the spread of slavery in the territories, right? John Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, who supports the Dred Scott decision and a federal slave code to protect slavery in any territory. Stephen Douglas, who believed in popular sovereignty, and John Bell, a Tennessean that was nominated by the Constitution Party that supported some sort of compromise to work the whole thing out. Right? When the votes are cast in the 60 election, Lincoln is elected to the presidency. Now, the obvious importance of the election of 1860, I haven't said yet, but is something that I hope you remember from our conversation. When Lincoln defeats Douglas, Bell, and Breckinridge for the 60 election, what happens? When he's elected, what happens? Go ahead,
When Lincoln is elected, South Carolina rescinds the ratification of the Constitution.
Yes, South Carolina rescinds their ratification of the Constitution and secedes from the Union. And that is in December of 60. 6 other states are going to follow. Now, obviously the secession of those 7 states and the subsequent secession of 4 more and the creation of the Confederate States of America is what prompts the Civil War, right? I mean, Lincoln and Northerners are going to refuse to accept Southern secession. They equate secession with treason. They raise an army to crush the rebellion, and that army that's attempting to crush the rebellion and the army that is attempting to protect it is really what engaged in what we call the Civil War. So the election of 60's significance, I won't even bother to have you reiterate it. The election of 60's significance is that it prompts the Civil War. Okay, let's go to the election of 96. The election of 96. Does anybody know who the candidates were in the election of 1896 besides myself and Christian? Stephanie, do you think Darius knows the... No, he's down there doing molarity in the chemistry, enjoying a molarity problem down there in the chemistry room, right? It was William McKinley versus William Jennings Bryan. That's right. William McKinley versus William Jennings Bryan. The Republican is William McKinley, a Gilded Age Republican. Basically, McKinley is an old guard Republican who believed, as we described today, in high tariffs, laissez-faire capitalism, low taxes, and sort of supporting business, anti-union. I mean, McKinley was a pro-business, laissez-faire, capitalistic, low tariff, low tax Republican. William Jennings Bryan was nominated by both the Democratic Party and the Populist Party. The significance of the election of 96 is the emergence and importance of the Populist Party. Now, the Populist Party had nominated a candidate in the election of 92, and that candidate had done fairly well. In the election of 96, the Populists had nominated Bryan along with the Democrats. What do you remember about the Populist Party? Anything at all? The populists are important. Yes, good.
Agrarian discontent.
Agrarian discontent, unhappy farmers. Do you remember anything about what they wanted? Yes.
The government to step in.
I mean, that's a good way of putting it. The populists wanted the government to step in for whom? Given the name. For the populists, for the... He wanted the government to step in for the people. So what did the populists think the government was doing before they stepped in for the people? They were supporting big business. It was a Wall Street government. A government by Wall Street, for Wall Street, in the pockets of Wall Street, with the business interests controlled by the large companies and trusts and conglomerates of the time for their benefits. The railroads and the banks were using the power of government to exploit the people. And now the populists said, oh, no, no, no. The power of government should be returned back to the people, right? And the government should work for the people. Now remember, as late as 1887, Grover Cleveland, the Democratic candidate, had said that the government should not support the people should support the government. The populists were turning that upside down and saying, no, 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 the government should actively intrude, take over banking, take over the railroads, you know, do other active things to support the people. All the workers of the factories and the farmers should unite and use their power to overthrow the power of big business and restore government back to supporting the people. Now, Bryan is on some level a standard bearer of this. But in the election of '96, the big issue that comes up is the free and unlimited coinage of silver. Now, we didn't talk about this much in class because of time, but one of the big issues in the Gilded Age was the money supply. You had farmers and agrarian interests that advocated for what we call soft money. They wanted more paper money, greenbacks, and most importantly, they wanted silver to be money just like gold was money. So they advocated for the free and unlimited coinage of silver at 16 to 1. And they argued against the gold standard. The business interest in McKinley supported a gold standard, 100% of all the money being backed by 100% gold. And so this becomes kind of a, you know, a fundamental kind of difference. It is on some level rural versus urban, right? You know, the free and unlimited coinage of silver, Bryan being from Nebraska, you know, an overt supporter of agriculture, a believer in the farm and farmers, right? You know, Bryan is going to kind of embody sort of rural America and what it stood for in the populist ideology. The significance of the election of '96 is how badly Bryan is defeated. Bryan is defeated by McKinley, which kind of represents the political power of the country was moving to the city. Bryan's message of agrarian discontent and the free and unlimited coinage of silver does not resonate in urban and suburban areas. And the power was increasingly moving to the city, to a middle class. And McKinley's kind of traditional message appealed more to them. So McKinley is elected in '96, and when he is, it ends the period of political parity of the Gilded Age. During the Gilded Age, the Democrats and the Republicans were basically equal in terms of elections. They were all highly contested. There was a huge voter turnout. Now, when McKinley defeats Bryan, the Republican ideology reigns supreme. The Republicans take over, the Democrats are divided, and they really aren't going to elect a president until they elect Woodrow Wilson. If you think about the Democratic Party, based on what we said, even in 24, their coalition has nothing to unify them. You know, Southern Democrats are going to be different from Northern Democrats. I mean, that's evident in the election of 1860. Now, uniting those factions are going to be difficult. They elect Grover Cleveland in 84 and 92, but that's the only Democratic presidents since Buchanan. And, you know, so the Republicans are going to kind of ascend politically after the election of 96. Now, next election is 1912, which is connected to that election. Because 1912, we just recently talked about. The election of 1912 is William Howard Taft, the incumbent president, is controversially nominated by the Republican Party. Taft represents roughly the conservative wing of the Republican Party, right? The old guard. Theodore Roosevelt, who had been a Republican president for 8 years, had bolted the Republican Party because the Republican Party had increasingly moved away from their insurgent or progressive wing, more towards their old guard or conservative wing, and in an attempt to kind of, bring progressivism as he saw it to the forefront in society, he mounts a campaign as a progressive. So there are kind of two Republicans, Taft and Roosevelt, sort of. The Democrats nominate Woodrow Wilson, a formerly conservative Democrat who had really kind of evolved in being more progressive as a Democrat. But what's interesting is, what does a progressive Democrat mean? You know, what does it mean to be a progressive Republican? Roosevelt kind of embodies that, right? What does it mean to be a progressive Democrat? In the election of 1912, Wilson is going to embody that, right? And their political kind of differences are the difference between the new nationalism and the new freedom. And really what it comes back to is the proper role of government. And also what's really true in the election of 1912 is what's at issue is the relationship between government and the people, and the relationship between government and big business. Big business, the factory and the city, had changed politics. And the election of 1912 is a reflection of those changes. How are we going to handle the city and the factory? Politically, there are kind of two approaches. One approach is, okay, we're going to accept it and regulate it, right? Theodore Roosevelt's. The other approach is, we're going to kind of break it up, right? And try to go back to the way things were. So one approach is, we're going to use a powerful national government to accept big business. Another approach is, we're going to use a powerful national government to break it up. Now, I mean, in both cases, you're using a powerful national government. That's what made the question that I asked you, Senator, kind of so interesting and complicated. You know, what are these approaches? Are they conservative? Are they liberal? You know, what are they? Now, what's significant about the election is that Wilson wins. And so the new freedom wins the election. But eventually, Wilson is going to behave by the end of his term as a new nationalist. And you start to see the beginnings of the Democratic Party now adopting kind of the progressive / populist ideology. Now that's not firmly determined yet. And we saw that in the election of 1924, that the Democrats haven't firmly accepted populism / progressivism, right? Because they nominate John Davis in 24. But in 28, they are going to nominate Al Smith. And in 32, did I give 32 as one of the elections? yeah, in 32 they're going to nominate, let's talk about that, Franklin Roosevelt. Now, the election of 32 is going to be significant because it's going to be in the middle of what's known as the Great Depression. And it is going to pit Herbert Hoover, the incumbent president who we elected today in class, versus Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is the governor of New York and a progressive, for lack of a better term. Now, I mean, there's lots about that and lots that we're going to talk about. But I think that the significance of that election, in just kind of talking about it just briefly, the significance of that election is that the Democratic Party kind of, finds itself with Roosevelt, right? Roosevelt is going to create a coalition that includes Southerners, labor, some intellectuals, African Americans, some business people. He is going to create what's called the New Deal Coalition. And the New Deal Coalition is going to elect Franklin Roosevelt 4 times to the presidency. The New Deal Democratic Coalition is going to dominate the national government up until the election of Ronald Reagan. Now, are there going to be Republicans that are elected to the presidency? Sure. Dwight D. Eisenhower is elected as a Republican in 52 and 54. And then, but really, if you think about it, Franklin Roosevelt is elected in 32. Franklin Roosevelt is elected in 36. Franklin Roosevelt is elected in 40, and Franklin Roosevelt is elected in 44. He is elected 4 times. Harry S. Truman, a Democrat, is elected in 48. Republican Eisenhower, 52 and 56. Democrat Kennedy in 60. Democrat Johnson in 64. Republican Nixon in 68 and 72. And then Reagan in 80, but really only a brief interlude of Republicans. Yes?
Who takes over when
Truman. Truman is his vice president. Okay. So we'll talk more about that one in class. Let's skip to the election of 68. The election of 68 and the election of 80 are the 2 that we aren't going to get to by the AP test. The election of 68, the Democrats are going to, well, let's do the Republicans first. The Republicans nominate in 68 Richard Nixon. Now, all of us, have a familiarity with Nixon. We know that Nixon is going to resign the presidency in disgrace in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal, right? We know that. So we know Richard Nixon. At the time he is nominated in 68, he was best known as an anti-communist zealot. Communist Russia had kind of changed the calculus in American politics. And Nixon was best known as a strong anti-communist. He had been Eisenhower's vice president. Nixon had been the vice president for 8 years in the Eisenhower administration. Nixon was a Republican. Nixon had run against Kennedy in 1960 and was narrowly defeated by Kennedy in 60. In 62, Nixon is going to run for the governorship of California and is defeated. And basically he's going to say upon his defeat to the press, just think, you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. But he doesn't give up. Nixon, from 62 until 68, is going to tenaciously basically crisscross the country, supporting Republican candidates. He becomes kind of an iconic figure in the Republican Party, and in 68, Nixon is triumphantly nominated for the presidency. And his campaign theme is this: law and order. stability. Now, that's a huge issue in '68, because '68 is arguably the most turbulent year in American history as far as unrest. So the election of '68 comes in the midst of tremendous turbulence. The incumbent president, think about this, the incumbent president at the time was Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson had taken over as president when Kennedy was assassinated. In other words, Lyndon Johnson was the vice president to Kennedy. Kennedy is assassinated in '63, Johnson takes over. In '64, Johnson is going to be triumphantly elected to the presidency in his own right, overwhelmingly elected to the presidency. But Johnson's demise is the Vietnam War. Johnson is going to escalate America's involvement in Vietnam. He's going to send ground troops into Vietnam. By 1968, America had well over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. They were drafting people into the military. Thousands of people were dying and were getting wounded in Vietnam. There was an active anti-war protest movement that opposed America's effort. And what kills Johnson is something called the Tet Offensive. I mean, we're going to talk at length about this, but the Vietnam War is a very confusing war. Do you know if you're winning? You know, I mean, we don't even know what it was about, but the Tet Offensive was an offensive launched by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese that was stunning. After all America had done it, all these guys died, the enemy still had enough power to do this. It appeared that somebody was lying, that this thing would never end, that we were mired in kind of this horrible conflict that was never going to end. It was dividing the country. Johnson was, now think about this, Johnson could have run again for the presidency and was ready to run again, and even was in the New Hampshire primary when a guy named Eugene McCarthy, a Minnesota Democrat, challenged Johnson in the New Hampshire primary and almost got half the votes, right? In March of '68, Johnson goes on national TV. Now think about this. These guys are announcing their candidacy for the presidency now. It's 2015 for the election in 2016. So it was March of '68. The election was in November. Johnson was considered to be a candidate, and he announces, nobody even knew it, I'm not running. I won't accept the party nomination. It's like a bombshell. Nobody even knew it. Right, so Johnson is out. Right, he's out of the picture. So now the incumbent president is out, and into the picture steps Robert Kennedy, the brother of the slain president, Eugene McCarthy, and the seated vice president, Hubert Humphrey. And they are battling for the Democratic nomination. Humphrey, Johnson, and oh, it's scary. Right? Humphrey, Kennedy, and McCarthy. Well, Kennedy has an appeal to him. He's against the war. His brother was the slain president. He's got the magical name. He's winning primaries. He's energetic. In June, he's assassinated on the platform. He's accepted. You know, these guys win a primary, they're on the platform, he's thanking everybody. Here comes a guy, Syrian, with a gun, shoots him dead. We all saw it. We all watched it. It was on TV. Boom. Everybody's going around, there's Kennedy. He's shot. His brother had been shot in '60. I failed to mention, also in March, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Riots broke out across the country. So, you know, riots were in the country, anti-war protests, the incumbent president drops out of the picture, the fair-haired boy, Robert Kennedy, is assassinated. This all happens in 1968. When the Democrats went to their convention, it was a mess, right? You know, Johnson was not the incumbent president. Hubert Humphrey was kind of the vice president. He had to adopt Johnson's party, you know, a platform about the war, you know, there was big protests against it, but Hubert Humphrey was a tenacious defender of civil rights. He was such a defender of civil rights that the southern wing of the Democratic Party bolts in '68. And they formed their own party called the American Independent Party. And they nominated George Wallace, Uncle George. Right? So 3 candidates in this election. Nixon wins, and his victory is largely attributed to his mantra of law and order, stability. I'm gonna end the Vietnam War. I'm going to straighten out the country. I'm going to restore stability and order. And Nixon reaches out to a group that he calls the silent majority, the average American who wants stability. And one of the things that Nixon is credited for in this election is what he calls the Southern strategy. Nixon is going to be the guy that converts the white South to the Republican Party. Humphrey's adoption of civil rights is enough for the white South to say, we're done with the Democrats. We're going to the Republican Party. And now we know that's where the white South is, right, with the Republican Party. So Nixon's election represents the rise of the silent majority. And Nixon is going to, orchestrate, to some extent, the withdrawal from Vietnam. He is overwhelmingly reelected. He wins almost every state in the Union in 1972. Now, the last election I want to talk about is the election of '80. So the '68 election is this turbulent election. Richard Nixon runs on a platform of law and order, restoring stability. I remember '68. It was, if you think about it, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, the Tet Offensive is a big deal. Martin Luther King's assassination is a big deal. Johnson announcing he was not going to seek re-election was a huge deal. And then Kennedy is assassinated in June on the platform in front of us all. It seemed like the country was coming unraveled, right? And Nixon seemed like he would provide to the country stability. Look, George Wallace wins 4 southern states. Wallace is an avowed racist. His thing is segregation. He says, segregation now, segregation today, segregation yesterday, segregation today, segregation tomorrow. Stood on the steps of the University of Alabama to prevent African American students from entering. So he's an avowed racist, segregationist. He wins 4 states in the South, right, in 1968. All right, okay, the last election is '80. The incumbent president in '80 was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter had been elected in '76 because he wasn't Richard Nixon. Jimmy Carter was the embodiment of what Nixon wasn't. Right? He was folksy, plain, a Georgia Democrat that carried his own suitcase and said, I'll never lie to you. He reeked of sincerity. He taught Bible classes in his church. Right? Carter just seemed like he was everything that Nixon wasn't. So he's elected in '76, but during the late '70s, the country again seemed to be becoming unraveled. And probably the most significant event in the late '70s was the Iranian hostage crisis. The Islamists, the Ayatollah, Khomeini, and I guess you would call them conservative Islamists, are going to depose the government of Iran and install a more conservative, anti-American Islamic state in Iran. In 1979, students, college students, Iranian college students, are going to storm the U.S. Embassy there and take hostage some 250 embassy employees. Did you ever see the movie Argo? Well, yeah, it's Argo, right? And here's the thing. We expected the Iranian government to protect our citizens in Iran. They did not. They fostered this kind of... And we demanded these people were held hostage. And here's Jimmy Carter, who's the President of the United States. And what seemed to be the case in '79 is that Carter seemed to be letting America slip. I mean, America had been the greatest country in the world in the aftermath of World War II. But in the 1970s, there were so many things that challenged the supremacy of the United States. The Arab oil embargo and the gas lines, our withdrawal from the Vietnam War, right? And now the Iranian hostage crisis just challenged what Americans thought about themselves. You know, we're the greatest nation in the world. It was the mentality that people had been weaned on. And now it seemed like there was high inflation, and Carter seemed like he was unable to deal with it. He called it a crisis of confidence. You know, I mean, I always say one of the greatest symbols of a change in attitude in the United States was the movie Rocky. Did you ever see the movie Rocky, the first one, 76, the classic Academy Award-winning Rocky movie? Now, I mean, I'm going to tell you this, and I'll tell you this because I know every word in that movie. And you could wake me up in the middle of the night and say, okay, he said this, what was said next? I'll know every word of that movie. Every line of dialogue, I must have seen that movie 20 times. Used to teach humanities. For years I taught humanities. We showed Rocky, right? Now, Rocky is an exciting movie. When it came out in the 70s, we didn't have VCRs or anything like that. You had to go to the theater, right? People would go 10, 12 times. Ask your parents. They'd go 10, 12 times to watch Rocky. People were cheering in the movie theater, like it was actually happening, right? You know, the fight scene was highly choreographed. Here's the thing. Who wins that fight, Rocky? Not Rocky, right? What kind of American movie is that? I mean, Rocky gets the girl, Adrian, who becomes progressively better looking as the movie goes, right? You know, I mean, it works. Remember that guy? Rocky wanted to fight that guy because he said she was retarded. You know, he says, "Hey, Rocky, take her to the zoo." You know, he talks like the zoo, right? You know, remember, he says, let's fight this guy, and Adrian is, you know, and then by the time it's over, I mean, things have improved for Rocky, you know, but he loses the fight, which becomes minimized. Now think about that. I mean, that's kind of a reflection of where America had come. Now, that sets the stage for Reagan, because in 80, Reagan comes along and says, he's nominated by the Republican Party, and he says this: America is great, and I'm going to make it great again. And you know what the problem is? What Ronald Reagan says in 1980? He says, you know what the problem is? It's not you, America. It's not you. It's not you, middle-class white person in your suburban home. That's not the problem. The problem is government. Government is not the solution, Reagan says. Government is the problem. Basically, what Reagan was saying is that the entitlements of the New Deal in the 1960s, the growth of government, the support of minority groups and others, and affirmative action had diminished the power of America. We were too down on ourselves, right? America was great, and he was going to make it great. He touched the New Deal coalition that Roosevelt had built. The middle class that had supported the Democrats and supported the New Deals increasingly saw the Democratic Party as being too controlled by minority interest and special interest and radical interest and abortionists and others. And these people, these Reagan Democrats, are going to leave the Democratic Party and vote for Ronald Reagan, and in their mind vote for America. It is considered to be an election that defines a conservative backlash. The liberalism of the 1960s, right? You know, that really kind of, you know, the law and order. I mean, think about Richard Nixon. He runs for the presidency in 1968 under the mantra of law and order. How does he leave? A crook, right? You know, so now that's kind of discredited. And in the 1970s, Carter comes along, and people say, where's that coming in? We want Rocky to win the fight, right? You know, we want Rocky to lose. We want him to get the girl and win the fight, and we want him to defeat the Russians, and we want to be America great again. And Reagan touches that, right? He touches that with his campaign rhetoric and says, we need to reduce taxes, get rid of government regulations, unleash prosperity. People buy it. They buy it big. It's a conservative backlash. Reagan is enormously popular. He crushes the incumbent president, Jimmy Carter, and it ushers in kind of the new right, this conservative revolution. Now, just one last thing, and we'll do this the first thing next time we get together. This question number 24 to 29 here is about that new right in 2001. And so when we get back together on next Tuesday, we'll do this discussion. Okay, what do we got, Paul? Thank you, Garrett. How many people were down in the LGI?